Her name is Dr. Vanita Menon. So Dr. Vanita Menon, she's a clinical and school psychologist. Sorry. So she can also practice in 30 different states. So if you guys have any issues or you guys want to reach out to her, she's very, very flexible, if you will. She also specializes in ADHD, autism, learning disabilities, and she's got ages that she does all the way from 3 years old to adulthood. We're very, very excited to have her on. And she also does therapy. So welcome, Dr. Vanita. And as always, I have the lovely Dr. Christine Henry.
Hello.
Thank you for having me. It's a very cool book that you're working through, and I love being part of this today.
Yeah. What did you think about just his approach? In general, looking at genetics, it's not something that as psychologists we really think about, or other than that genetics has an impact, but
certainly, and that is like the age-old question, like nature versus nurture. We learned that in Psych 101. By the way, I didn't like Psycho 101. I'm like, wait, I chose this profession, but I don't like the first class. So, but and it got better. So, but yeah, no, it is. It's a common question that I get from parents. Is it? Did I do something? Is it from the other side of the family? Like whose genes are these? What's going on? And so it really is an intersection. Is how I try to explain it. Another $1 million question that I get is he being a teenager or is this the ADHD time? Right? I get that a lot, and I say, yeah, it's both. It's always that intersection between age and experiences and neurological wiring. So I really appreciate the humor and the content of the chapter. I like the way that it really feels very approachable. What did you guys think?
Yeah, I really love it, and I think you make a great point though with the parents blaming themselves, because especially in this book, it always talks about prenatal development and the conditions during pregnancy, and it's like we already have mom guilt as it is, and then to read that stuff, it's but what I appreciate that he talks about is throwing the dads in there a bit about things that affect the sperm. I'm like, finally, that men are in the equation, and the epigenetics with men. I appreciated that.
Now they say that the gender comes from the man, right?
Yes.
Yep. I just want to sound smart for a little bit.
But I'm trying to think of some of the questions I thought was interesting is talking about hormones, like you're talking about teenage stuff, but like with ADHD, I've seen more articles talking about for women and menopause that ADHD symptoms can be worse. I don't know if you see that with people kind of getting really late diagnosis of ADHD.
Very much. People who, and it can become what we call latent. So like if they had an early diagnosis and then they treated it in some way, behavioral therapy, medication, and then, had a period where they were feeling able, and meeting expectations of their own or their environment, and then something shifts again later. For women, like after having children or perimenopause, which can last a long time. COVID was another example of not hormonal, but certainly mimicking a lot of ADHD characteristics: brain fog, memory, fatigue, difficulty with working memory, like storing information, multitasking, which was brought up in the chapter as well. Multitasking is a myth. I say that every week to somebody.
Yeah, he said that in an earlier chapter too. Is multitasking.
Yeah, I was pretty happy to see that because it's a huge illusion that we think, that we can do, be on a live stream and make dinner and like help a kid with homework and try to do that all at once. No, you have to respect the energy, the capacity that your brain has, right? And adjust accordingly, not the other way around. And I laughed when one of the lines was like, the brain is the diva. I'm like, yes, needs attention, definitely needs attention. So,
Yeah.
and respect.
Right. And what I'm curious if you can say a little about like and I know this is not in the book, but it's a side mental tangent, but differences, and I know we don't want to necessarily have to gender things, right? But people socialized as women, what differences like for ADHD symptoms? What are differences that you see? How does it present differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. Both with neurodiversity and autism specifically, we are getting more research backing for there are some valid gender differences. First of all, the underdiagnosis, and the reason for that being girls are more verbal, and so that implies to have a larger verbal capacity. That implies some, publicly perceived like strength, and if they are like struggling with word retrieval or limited vocabulary, like it shows up as a red flag in the earlier elementary years compared to later. And girls tend to have like a larger verbal store, so that gets missed. Girls tend to copy others better. They watch, observe, and copy. And that leads to masking. That's a camouflaging and masking are very commonly used terms now, but we all do it at some point. It's really the degree to which you're doing it, and how much you're like negating your true instincts or intentions. That's where it becomes harmful. But again, it's another reason why girls are missed, but are able to like follow along, and those are probably the top two reasons. There are more, of course. What do you see in your practice?
Yeah, I have a lot of late diagnosed women too, and you see, they struggled a lot in puberty, and then after childbirth, or with Serenity was the same. My daughter was very verbal, and so many things were missed for her. Both autism and the ADHD was kind of missed for her. And she is the inattentive type too. So I think this is so much of the DSM criteria were developed more on boys, especially white boys, right? And so not looking at like what variation that can have. And so I think for her, and my son is ADHD as well, but I say he's capital H with ADHD, and he never sits still and all this stuff. And so he's very classic presenting, like he has trouble sitting in his seat or whatever. And Serenity can sit in her seat just fine. And she has developed an art of looking like she's paying attention and doing schoolwork.
Yep.
But she's not,
There's the copying and camouflaging, so there it is. So yeah, very much cool that you have examples of both in your very own household,
I know, exactly.
Fun at homework time, sure, so.
Oh, every night's a battle with homework.
Yeah, and
so
that's
what about
why,
age?
Sorry. One of the comments in the chapter about like that one size fits all education, like somewhere in the middle of the chapter, that is a real struggle, and that's actually why I started out in clinical psych and moved to school psychology, and now do both, because we really found like in the hospital setting, schools were not, earlier in my career, not prepared for extending the work of the hospital stay or the clinic work. They just didn't have the staff and the insight, and it is public school, right? That's not the purpose of public school necessarily, but that one size fits all mentality, thankfully, has greatly shifted across my
Mhm.
career. And we've been more and more individualized because, motivation is a tricky thing, right? Motivation is perceived as a lot of different things, and can come across as laziness. The opposite of motivation can come across as laziness, attitude, and misbehavior, and not applying themselves, and all these things that are really related to probably some executive functioning deficits or ADHD
Mhm.
that maybe got undetected along the way.
Well, yeah. Well, before my daughter got the autism diagnosis, a therapist said she had ODD, and I'm like, that doesn't feel like that fits for me,
Right. Right. I've seen
And
that. I've seen a lot of reports coming in, and like late diagnoses, as you say, and then they're looking for like the therapeutic support. And there's not as many people working with adults as maybe we need. So when I meet new people and I see the developmental history, and I'm sitting there thinking, why didn't anyone? It's so obvious. How come no one saw it? Where was everybody? But like I would say, about 10 years ago, my oldest person that I diagnosed was a 23-year-old female, but that age is no longer an outlier. I really struggled with that now not because I wasn't sure of the evaluation process and the data, but the fact that how could I be the first one noticing this? How could I be the first,
Well,
then?
what's with my practice though, most of my clients are late 20s, 30s, and I have some people in their 40s, and they have a trauma background, and I think that everybody just attributed everything to trauma. And like, the autism was missed, or the ADHD and autism was missed. And once they realize it, it's this, like you said, sort of anger, like, how did nobody see it? And I explained to them the knowledge that we have now about ADHD and autism in women, there's no way that you would have been diagnosed. That's just not, and even, so many practitioners, teachers are still going off of outdated information.
Yeah.
All the cutting edge stuff that's coming out of the UK and Australia.
Now, I do have a question. With gender being so different and being able to have different symptoms, like you said, like the mimicking and all that stuff, or the masking, what about age? What do you see when it comes to age and the different symptoms? So like a 3-year-old, how would you be able to say, okay, this 3-year-old has ADHD, autism, or falls somewhere on the spectrum? What's the limitations that they're supposed to be at? And then where do you usually see the issues at?
You want me to go first? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, you have you especially the little ones. I only have my kiddos as far as data. I don't have the developmental training that you do.
Yeah, a lot of times, early on, pre-language, the really young ones, the early verbal stages, they show how they feel with their bodies. So I used to joke about my younger one, like fall down dramatic, like fall on the floor, like, oh, are you upset about something? Okay. Like they'll show with their bodies, right? But even with every developmental stage, there's a range of what's typical, what's expected in terms of milestones. That research and data is really good. Developmental psych, one of the oldest branches of psychology, the stages of development, even executive functioning skills. We know like ranges of like a child between age 3 and 5 should be able to do this, 5 to 7, and so on. So we have those markers that help us compare. It is not just a judgment call on my part, but it's definitely based on some norms and some data that help us know like roughly. And there's a wide range of age appropriate. Sometimes parents come to me and say, well, he's reversing his letters when he writes like B for D and so on. And I said, that is not an automatic sign of, dyslexia. That's actually developmentally appropriate to a point. If you're 15 and doing that, we've got to talk about this, But if you're 3 to 7 even and doing that, You don't make much of that, but it's a concern for parents. So I always say, if you're not sure, reach out and have a conversation. And a couple of sessions. Like this was fun. I had 3-year-old twins in my office.
Oh goodness.
That was fun. And mom was like, I just want to double check because this is my first set of kids and I don't know. And so it's really nice to have that, just like a second opinion. Pediatricians are a good first line because they see a huge range. Asking your family or your teacher at school, so they see dozens of the same age, children. As a parent, I asked my children's teacher, like, well, you see hundreds of fourth graders. I have one at a time, so total sample size of 2. So, you tell me, what's the range? So it's an important question to ask, like the context. I'm always using that word too, like, what's the context of what's going on? Headbanging, anything that's not automatically bad or good behavior. It's an expression, right? So especially pre-verbal. So how are they showing their needs? How are they expressing themselves is a really important question to kind of investigate with families.
And I think the context of it. So what I think was difficult with Serenity is she was in a GT program. And so when you ask about how she is in comparison to her peers, I think there probably are a lot of neurodivergent GT kiddos there. And so it's like, oh, she's not much different from peers. And so many of the things, as a parent was, is she making eye contact and all this stuff? And she was, but the little things that her teacher said, I wouldn't have thought was an autistic trait, but like there'd be super little, like, 1, even 1 and 2, that the whole class would be sitting there reading books together. And she would just get up and leave and walk across the classroom and just do her own thing, and she fits the PDA profile, which I love, the persistent drive for autonomy. I love that new terminology with that because I think that really fits her too.
I didn't like the P for pathological at all.
Yeah,
so
I don't like that either.
We don't need more of that language.
Now, why is that? Just curious. I don't know anything about it. I'm just asking.
Yeah, can you say a little bit about what PDA is? And
Yes.
So PDA, is considered like one persistent drive for autonomy or pathological demand avoidance. Those are the 2 terms that we're talking about. And again, I don't really want to approach this from a deficit model, right? I don't want to say there's something wrong with you, and therefore you have XYZ diagnosis. But that is the origin of our field. That is the origin of psychiatry and therefore psychology as well. It's a big cultural shift in the profession to be phrasing it differently, because it takes the weight and the expectation off of the individual and moves it over to the environment and the adults, perhaps, or the environment, the situation, other factors. It's a shared responsibility. And autonomy sounds a lot more positive, like engagement, versus pathological avoidance, and it's a reframe, and I think it's an important one. In fact, this morning when I was talking about a case with my team, the question I kept asking was like, what is the intention behind the behavior? What do you think is the intention? Are they trying to be funny? Are they trying to, like, what's driving that? Because it is, you can't manipulate another person unless you have that ability to, he's just being sneaky, or he's just trying to get away with something. Avoidance, you have to have the intent, right? And awareness to be able to manipulate certain experiences so that people follow your lead. That's pretty, like, higher order thinking and ability. That's not That's not a small thing, you know.
Yeah.
And so I just don't think it's fair to continue to pile on like label after label that are labels that are pejorative and not leading to a problem-solving mindset, you know, where you can say like, well, what can we do about this? You know, like, oh, you fell down, you're showing me with your body that you're upset. Let's practice some words that go with that, you know, and
Yeah.
or like give me a thumbs down if you can't hear pre-verbal, like or pointing to a face that matches, like teaching those kinds of things versus like the dramatic falling down, you know. So for every age you can teach something like that, you know.
Well, and having
Um,
that viewpoint just makes things worse, you know. And Anthony, you said like asking, how does it look different in kids versus adults? What I see in adults, they've adapted their life in a way that works with their brain. You know, different jobs, different professions, different relationships, whatever, that they accommodate their life. And so it causes more difficulties when they're younger versus when they're older.
okay. Now, I guess I definitely get that. My kids are about to be like, Daddy, they did this, or is this doing this? So I got my ears in two different places. They're about to come.
Yeah, I
Yes,
can
son.
hear him.
Yes, you can go to the room. Sorry.
That's okay.
So,
At some point you might hear a dog barking here.
so
Yeah, I got
my
mine
next
in the
question,
back,
right?
jumping up and down off the couch.
Is it the number of symptoms or is it the amount of categories before you come up with a diagnosis? So is it saying, hey, if you reach 4 of these symptoms, or I'm just throwing a number out there, then we'll give you whatever we believe it is? Or is it, hey, you have to have a certain amount of symptoms in speech to cognition to motor skills to, I mean, you get what I'm trying to say? So how is that what you guys go off of to determine whatever analysis that you guys come up with?
Yes and yes.
Oh,
It's
okay.
not one or the other. It's really like it's a number or a severity, how much does it impact your life? How are you not able to meet the age appropriate expectations, also within certain categories for both diagnoses. You know,
Okay.
and
So
that's where like school psychology lines up really well, because you have to demonstrate what we call an adverse effect. It's fine, like someone with ADHD that's mild, that's really well managed, has had a lot of support, doesn't automatically need like a special ed plan, because there may not be an adverse effect on their performance. It might be well managed. So it's not an automatic, like you have to have an IEP because you have a diagnosis. That's a big myth as well. So, but yeah, you know, and school criteria and clinical can be there's a lot of overlap, of course, but there are some key differences too. And that's another time where families get caught in the middle. So it's important to really lay it out and walk people through, like, this is what the diagnostic manual says, this is how it lines up, these are the pieces of data. You never make a decision based on one score, one data point, it's not.
and it's so crazy because just having this conversation, I just literally realized that's probably why they call it a spectrum, right? Based off of severity. So say, hey, if this symptom is extreme in this situation, but I guess normal in other situations, then it wouldn't be so either high or low or vice versa. But if you're in different sort of aspects and there's multiple severe, then I'd never put that together until we literally just had that conversation. So that's crazy. I don't know why I didn't put that together.
Yeah. And then to rule out other things like trauma, depression, anxiety, so many other things that kind of go together with it too. Yeah.
Now, I like what you said earlier about motivation. So with your guys', I guess, experiences, what do you find is the biggest motivator when it comes to children? And then I'll talk about it obviously with dogs, but what's your guys' success rate when it comes to motivating children? I know it's a hard one. I got a 5 and a 7-year-old.
Well, what's interesting, right? They talk one thing they talk about in the book that like they had these activities that was like a puzzle or something, and they had low achievers, which I don't know what that definition of low achievers were, performed better at a task if they believed it was fun, and then high achievers did worse if they thought it was for fun and not for a grade. So I think motivation is super complicated, right? That there's not just one thing that will motivate somebody, and yeah, so I think it's super individual, not just for kids but adults as well.
And dogs. I mean, so for example, in the dog world, you talk about, hey, this breed's the smartest. This breed, I mean, so border collies, they're incredibly intelligent. Then you get your German shepherds, you get your Australian shepherds, poodles, golden retrievers, Dobermans. Like those are the very intelligent breeds. Now, when you have this dog, and it goes back again, Dr. Menon, what you were talking about earlier, where you have this drive, right? So those dogs, in my opinion, I mean, not only do they do brilliant work, but they'll do anything for a tennis ball. They'll do anything for a Kong. They'll do anything for a Frisbee. So just utilizing motivation in itself with these animals, you can literally get a dog to do a backflip, jump off your back to catch a Frisbee, just do crazy odor work and tracking just to bite a tennis ball. So when it comes to the intelligent level of a dog, in my opinion, it's really hard to determine which breed is actually smartest, just because what's motivated to some dogs might not be motivated to something else, right? Another good example is you have dogs that are really food motivated, but that only goes for so long, right? You can only give a dog so much food before that food is such a high value treat and high value reward. The more you use it, the less it becomes valuable, right? Where the dog's like, and then with us, in order to, I guess, counter condition constantly getting that treat, we have our two different types of reward systems. We have our fixed variable reward system, right, where that number always stays constant. So whenever you're teaching something, that number will be 1, where you're saying, hey, every time you do this task, you're gonna get paid or rewarded each time. Once that dog understands what 1 is, then you can say, okay, now I'm gonna do 2, right? And then I work your way up all the way to 5 until you say every 2 times you do it, every 3 times you do it, so on and so forth. Once that dog is very familiar with 1 through 5 through that training, then you do that mixed variable reward system to where the number never stays constant, and now it's 1 to 5. So it keeps integrity of that command, but at the same time, its motivation still remains, and the dog's like, I don't know when I'm going to get it, but eventually I'm going to get it. So that's how you can work on your impulse. That's how you can work on just so much stuff. But again, the dogs that thrive in those positions are the dogs that are the extreme working dogs that will do anything for that tennis ball. But I'm pretty sure if I found a bulldog that was motivated for something, that bulldog would have the same capabilities. I've seen crazy, and when I say crazy, I'm talking about just a crazy amount of intelligence come from a breed that is like, where did this come from? That's not known for you to be like this. But they're incredibly smart. But it's also abnormal that this dog, for an example, I've seen a bulldog, or I've even seen just a pug that loves a tennis ball. And that's kind of rare where I'm at, right? A lot of bulldogs, they just like to sit down and be quiet or eat or just lay around. But in this one dog, that's the same thing. It would do anything for this tennis ball. So when you have that motivation, the sky's the limit with us. So I'm obviously assuming it's the same with people, right? But motivation can only go so far.
Well, and I think what I see a lot is people who grow up thinking they're not intelligent, and it's because of the ADHD or maybe the autism. And then when they go for like the type of testing that Vanita does, there's ways to measure ability minus those things, minus the distractions. And I've had clients just like be dumbfounded by like, my IQ's above average, right? And thinking that they were stupid, right? Because they can't maintain attention, because it takes them so much longer to complete a homework assignment. So that's been amazing to see.
Yes, I was speaking to a teacher without saying any names, obviously, and she was talking about there was this little girl in her class that, like the parents, everybody was like, "She's not smart. You know, we're gonna have to put her in special education. She takes really, it takes a long time for her to grasp it and understand it." And then through testing, this one teacher, and it wasn't dyslexia. It was something that they said that was very rare, where they would read a word and they would read it backwards, but it wasn't dyslexic. I forgot what it's called. But whenever she started writing it, she was literally writing it backwards, like a literal backwards, where they're just like, "Oh my God, this is what it is." I forgot what it is. I really wish I can text her and say, "What's that name of that thing again?" But whenever they figured that out and they got her the help, she started thriving. So
Mhm.
it's baffling how, like you were talking about, you guys were talking about earlier, is like, how did nobody catch this when it comes to literally writing backwards words?
Mhm.
Mhm. What's funny is like that's how we realized my daughter was gifted is I bought her this projector to practice her spelling words. And old school projectors have that mirror so it
Hmm.
reflects corrects. It was a cheap kid one, so it didn't. So it reflected inverted and backwards or whatever. And so I was like, "Oh, let's put it away." And Serena's like, "No, I got it." And she wrote the spelling word inverted and backwards so it projected correctly. I was
Oh
just
Oh
wow.
wow.
yeah. So
Oh,
I
visual
was like,
visual strength for sure.
yes, intense. Yeah, it was amazing. So,
Yeah, it's incredible how just the mind works in general. It really
mhm.
is. I mean, it's something where, just like epigenetics, I really don't think that we're going to get a full understanding of the capabilities. I mean, again, I'm not a doctor by any means, but they say we only use like 30% or 40% of our brain, right? Now,
Less
I mean,
actually. Yeah. Yeah.
really, what's the number?
Well, I mean, in the chapter it went down as low as 10, but I don't know if it's that low. We'll have to see what like, we have cool technology that assesses things better now than ever before. So,
Now, quick question. Obviously, this isn't book related, and this is going to be very opinionated. Why do you think we only use so much of our brain?
He said in the book, but I do not recall what he said.
why we use so little?
Yeah.
Mm,
And I
trying to
guess
remember.
again, it's opinionated. Again, it's opinionated. I mean, it's so intriguing because if it's something so big, and not only so big, but so valuable and just necessary, if you will, right? Where we only use that small amount of it. I mean, there's got to be a reason, because you also hear about these very brilliant people who
Well,
end up,
I think it just
getting some
depends
sort of
on
medical
what,
diagnosis.
right? What because the all parts of the brain have functioning, right? And so some of it is functioning just to keep us breathing, right? Like the fine
Yeah.
brain and all this stuff. So I think I don't know. I can't recall. I didn't write that fact down as far as what
Yeah, I mean, I
percentage.
think different regions of the brain have different purposes. So you may not like, the survival mode or the things that regulate us automatically, there are different purposes. So I think it depends on what you're asking. Like, are you talking about like high level thinking and how much of that is being used? We're not using it a
Yeah.
lot, or, like a verbal versus long-term retrieval. I mean, there's so many different parts that that's why you can, you know, um, work through some sort of sometimes, some traumatic brain injury because the brain is also adaptable because one part is injured, it finds a way to other body parts do that too, right? So we've heard about
That makes sense.
um, so
Yeah.
that I mean that's pretty powerful, and I don't think we
That
even
makes
have
sense.
full awareness. But I know that I have heard that I don't know all the neuroscience behind it certainly, but I have heard that if there's an injury in one region, there's a way that the system compensates for that.
Hmm. The
Yeah, it's
other
just
thing that the book talked about I thought was interesting. I don't know if you saw the I guess the Doogie Howser mice they talked about. It's
Mhm.
these mice that they genetically engineered to have more intelligence or something. Uh, but the side effect of it is they had more pronounced fear response, and like they connected that with like higher memory levels. And so for me, this is the connection I made with the autism. And some people have, this giftedness, then maybe the sensory stuff is connected to that. And some, I was so surprised he talked about savants in this, but I just wish he would have talked about it in a more specific way. I didn't know if you had a reaction to that section at all.
Um, I think, I mean, that you're right. That part felt a bit dated, for lack of a better word. I felt like it could use a little update.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, um, I didn't. I think that's also a familiar term for people.
Yeah.
Sort of,
Yeah, but I think it also just perpetuates an incorrect
Yeah.
stereotype
Yeah, it
of it.
does. It does.
Yeah.
Now, I was watching this study, and this may be off topic, but this is perfect. You're the two perfect people to ask this. They had this guy, and they put a fake hand in front of him, right? And they put the curtain up so they couldn't see his real hand. And then what they would do is they get the brush and they'd be like, okay, I'm touching your finger now. And they were like kind of rewiring the brain to where they touch the finger like this
Mm-hmm.
on his real finger, but then they'd have him look at that hand and they would brush it the exact same way on both sides. And then they did the middle finger, then they did all of them, then they did the poking of the hand. And then eventually that person thought that the mannequin hand was his real hand. And then it was like a rubber mannequin hand. It looked pretty real. And then what he would do is he stopped brushing it on his real hand, and he started going like this on the fake hand, and his other finger would start reacting. And then he got a hammer, and then he hit his actual fake hand, and the guy had that same response. He's like, ah. But the whole purpose of that study was showing how you can rewire the brain in certain aspects to make something that's fictitious reality. And I thought that was
Well,
amazing.
and it also it's the mirror neurons, right? And he talked about it in the chapter too.
Mhm.
But I found there's some, Vanita, I don't know if you've seen like these interesting studies with for some autistic people having over empathy or hyper empathy, and that being connected to it is that if you are watching somebody who is experiencing pain, that you feel that pain too. My husband's
Yeah.
like that actually. With he cannot watch improv shows or comedy shows where people are getting embarrassed. Like he literally is like, "Oh, it's painful. I can't watch it." Right?
Yeah.
And there's some research saying that that's kind of connected to the mirror neurons.
That makes sense. I mean, neurons are involved for empathy in general, and then that, like that hype, like that, it doesn't take much to get that saturated. Then, like for your husband, whereas like an under aroused system would come across as like very cold and detached and apathetic, But again, it goes back to the mirror neurons, and it came up right in the. Oh, it was a different book that I was reading something about trauma, and that too was talking about like how to co-regulate, and mirror neurons are activated then as well. And if it's activated, like attention is attention, and even negative attention can activate this. So that's what leads to people accepting maybe certain traumatic experiences as like the acceptance piece of it, saying, I guess it's how it's supposed to be, or
Like this is the normal.
And what is normal, yeah. So, but again, those neurons are extremely powerful. Same with like remembering, like going through a traumatic experience and then remembering it. If you're hooked up to biofeedback, it shows us a very similar, maybe less intense, but a very similar neurological pattern. So when I first learned that kind of blew me away. That just the power of your mind to recreate that same physiological experience, that stuck with me, you know.
Yeah, just like PTSD. Yeah, so I have PTSD, and one of the things so I was involved in a really bad hazardous accident, and now whenever I go past like an 18-wheeler, I literally smell it. I can smell it, and I can feel it, and I can feel everything that was going on. And then I mean, I don't remember much from it, but it sounds exactly like what you're talking about. It really does. It was crazy. But I get the same way like your husband. If I see surgeries or anybody having some sort of or dealing with some sort of extreme adversity or pain or surgeries, my knees hurt. And I'm like, oh, my knees. I don't know why, but it's always my knees. Nothing else hurts. Someone can be popping this giant pimple, and I'm like, oh, my knees.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. Have you seen those videos? It's like Dr. Pimple Popper or something.
Oh,
yeah. I'm like, oh, my knees. So it's,
yeah.
So would you say they're called mirror neurons?
Yeah. And it's just the way brain is wired. It's fascinating.
It's fascinating.
Man.
It's also my excuse for not watching sports, because like, oh, I cringe when they fall and hit their heads. You know, World Cup is going on now, and
Yes.
you know, football, whatever it is, you know, I'm like, oh no, I have a really big reaction to people falling and getting hurt. So,
But to me, like, that's another example of how it's so opposite to how people think about autism, right?
Mhm.
Is that, you know, that you're kind of like a robot and not having emotions or whatever, but
Yeah.
this really over empathy and really feeling people's emotions,
Mhm.
that's autism too, you know?
It
And
is.
people just don't see that.
Even the theory behind related to that, you know, the theories behind why eye contact is difficult, right? It's not automatically only an avoidance. It's like it's too intense, you know.
Mhm.
Not it doesn't mean anything. Like, why do I have to make eye contact? That doesn't matter. It's not necessarily that reason behind, you know. So
Now,
lots and
is
lots
it
of busting here. So
Mhm.
now? I've always wondered that too. My son, my 7-year-old, he has autism, and it's very hard for him to make eye contact. And I've always wondered. And again, this is probably horrible for me to think of because I'm a dog trainer. Well, with dogs, it's very rude to look them in the eyes, and to them, they automatically sense conflict. Is it the same thing where it's conflict where they're like, "Oh, I don't want to look," because it's conflict? Yes, son. Can I play Switch? Of course. Sorry.
no problem. I think it's highly stimulating, right? To look at someone directly in the eye,
How so?
you know, it's highly stimulating. And there's a lot. I mean, I have clients who ask me, like, I don't know where to look. Like, do I look at one eye? Do I look in the middle? Do I look at, what do I do? You know, like, I mean, very literally asking me, like, and so we practice in the mirror, and like we talk about this in session and make it an okay question to ask. I mean, I really want to meet people where they are. So, but for some, it is like, well, why? Why do I need to do that? What, in not understanding the message that it gives, like it's a sign of respect, or, well, I don't think it's a sign of respect, so why does it matter? You know, and for some, it's just too intense of an engagement between people.
And if you look at like their physiological response to it, it's really activating and really distressing, right? And that's where, you know, old school approaches would be like, you know, the goal is for them to make eye contact, right? And kind of the approaches now, it's like, can't it be okay if they don't make eye contact? Like if it causes that much physical discomfort, how important is that eye contact? And so I only work with adults, right? And so the adults I work with, they come up with workarounds. Like I'll look at your nose, I'll look at your eyebrows.
Right.
So they're not, you know, these people who are really kind of trained to do this, they're still not looking you in the eyes, right? And the whole meaning behind it, it's to make the neurotypical person comfortable, right? Is because
Or be
the
like,
other
what's
person
on my
is feeling,
nose?
yeah. And so the other person's feeling upset, and we need to not make the other person feel upset. So we need to force you to make this eye contact, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And also the eye contact needs to be congruent with what you're saying or doing, right? Because like someone staring at you and never blinking and like always looking at you, that's also not what we typically expect. You would expect a gaze and a gentle look away, look back. Sometimes you look at someone for emphasis. It's like punctuation, right? Exclamation point. You can look at someone with a questioning gaze, like it has purpose, right? And so teaching those other ways to use eye contact, like there's a reason why it can be used. It's not the only way, but yeah, it's not, again, back to that one size fits all. It's not required, right? So
Yeah, I'm glad about how much progress has been made on it because, yeah, I mean, it was all habituation back then, being like, no, you got to do this, you got to get over it. And yeah, I can see a lot of people constantly being exposed to that and be like, oh, that's way too much. And now I got, issues, or now I feel uncomfortable even talking to people because just the situation of, the conflict or whatever's going on in their mind, just that, I guess the repetitiveness of being uncomfortable just makes them not even want to talk to people.
Yeah, because they're constantly like, am I doing this right? Right? Like the social anxiety, am I smiling? And I've had clients verbalize this as adults, right? Like, am I smiling enough? Do I look engaged? I'm smiling too much. Oh, I look creepy now.
Yeah.
And are just like so anxious in those situations versus some of the therapy work is helping them unmask. And so that they, don't have this like fake smile all the time, that maybe they just kind of have a more neutral face, and can that be okay? Yeah.
And to kind of go back, tying it all together, the concept of like that brain that can multitask, it's very draining on your battery.
Yes.
To be so hyper vigilant about like, am I doing this right? How am I doing? Like kind of always, I couldn't do that. Like to be always aware of myself as like a performer, to be like judging, critiquing, and then actually trying to do my job too. That's tough, and feels like a huge extra burden and unbearable one. So,
Yeah, and how that affects everything. I think so. My son has dysgraphia, and he is a
That's
very
what it
creative
was.
dysgraphia. Yeah.
Yes.
And it's not rare, but like it is like motor skills and ability to write and to hear sounds and to write it out. But he had a worksheet. It was like, write this story, and it was to handwrite it, and he just couldn't because he didn't have the fine motor skills, and so his accommodation is to type it out. And so if we take out the writing, he can just flow, right? And so like with some of this autistic masking, it's like if somebody doesn't have to have that energy of I need to make eye contact, then they're able to have a more fluid conversation, or verbalize themselves better if they're not trying to focus on all these little other things. Does that make sense, Anthony?
It does. It does. I guess coming from an energy standpoint, it really does. And multitask in general. And I think with me, again, this is like the dog training me, right? I guess with me, it's, hey, if they're constantly in a state of multitasking because they're focusing on where to look, they're focusing on trying to listen to the conversation and trying to focus on what to say and engage and so on and so forth, just the constant environment of being in a multitask state. You would think in regular situations where they would multitask, excluding, conversation, they would thrive. Does that make sense?
Possibly. I mean, I think ADHD folks sometimes having all that stimulation.
Yeah.
But I don't know that still after a while that gets exhausting. Like you can only maintain that energy.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm trying to say is they use so much energy, but when you take out the communication, a part of it, right? And you have it focused on computers and hey, you can do this on one computer, then you got to do this on the other computer, or whatever. If it's something that's more natural that they're actually engaged with and they want to engage with, even though they're kind of releasing potentially the same amount of energy, they could be more progressive and they can be more, I guess,
focused
and situationally aware and thriving in that environment because they're always multitasking in that state. But now it's something that they enjoy doing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
This is where my mind's going right now.
Yeah. One thing I like to suggest to some clients, depending on if it's appropriate, of course, is like a lot of people say, I'm really inconsistent. I start something and then I don't finish it or I don't keep up with it. Another common thing that I hear about is motivation and lack of. And so sometimes I say, like, well, how about you make a list of the things like that you want to accomplish in a week, or like things that you should do for your life that could be different than my list. And then look at the list and then say, well, I'm in the mood to do this. And if you pick something from the list and you're in the mood, you're probably going to do it. And whatever you do from that list is something you wanted done. So isn't that great? So instead of, because they're always approaching this when I meet them, at some point they're approaching it as like what's wrong with me? There's something wrong with me.
What's a moral flaw, right? Like I'm a bad person, shame.
Yeah. And so like I'm sick of this, kind of thing. And so and then you sort of turn that and say, like, if you're in a mood or you have an energy burst or a phase, to do things, then pick something that fits that from the list. It's your list. You want these things. And go with it and let the hyper focus kick in. It's okay, because it's on your list, So, I mean, I know personally, like I do a certain task better in the morning than I do in the afternoon. And so those are my like phases, right? So, and if I can structure my time to match that, I'll just get more done. And then I say the cool part is then I don't have to be mad at myself later for not getting something done, but got off the list, right? So
I haven't read the book. I don't know if you have the Laziness Does Not Exist or something like that. Have you heard of that book?
I have heard of it. I haven't read that particular one.
Yeah, but it sounds great. It's particularly looking at ADHD and how that's an incorrect way of looking at motivation and all of that.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anybody that has any questions. We didn't, ask. We forgot to ask. I don't know if there are people watching or not. If anybody has any questions about ADHD or autism or learning differences.
I think this is just a really interesting conversation to where people are like, man, I just want to listen, I mean, because it's not often you have, these guests on, just talking about brain stuff. And I mean, it's very fascinating. It really is.
We think so, right, Christy?
Yeah, I know.
we think so.
Totally geek out on all this stuff, right? Not enough time in the day to read everything.
For sure. I mean, like you were saying, Anthony, when I got my first ever dog in my life in February of 2020, not having no idea that the pandemic was coming and all of that, but finally found the one for us. And I'm like, oh, how do everyone's like, oh, potty training and all this stuff. And I don't know how to do this. I have to figure it out, reading. And then it clicked for me, like, wait, this is behavior theory.
Yes,
I can do this,
It's operant conditioning, classical conditioning. It's,
yes, and I'm like,
it's it.
Wow, this is cool. And I'm like, I just don't speak dog yet, but I know the theory behind this. I can do this, and then it clicked for me, like, okay, we just need to figure out how to match expectations.
Yes.
And had a ball ever since, but it's a lot. The training is a lot of fun, so.
I'm telling you this right now, when it comes to dogs, once you find that primary reward, oh my God, it's going to be amazing. So again, and I say again, I'm not saying it directed towards you, but I say this almost on every podcast. The way that you can reward a dog using positive reinforcement is either by treats, pets, praise, play, or interaction. And interaction it's not just like, hey, bud, how you doing? It's you get this issue a lot when it comes to dogs that want to run away. So they run away and then they won't run until you come out of the door. And when they come out of the door, then they got their butt in there and they're like, let's go, chase me. And then they run. And the other person's like, Fido, get your butt back over here. And they're like running, having the time of their life, right? So even with that interaction, I mean, that's huge positive reinforcement for them. But once you figure out one of those 5 that dog is willing to do anything for, oh my gosh, it's beautiful to see. And in my experience, if I get a dog that's not really treat motivated, if I see a dog that's not really toy motivated or more pets or interaction in that way, they're just kind of like, obviously it leads to play. And with playing, it could be anything. And sometimes, believe it or not, you got to teach a dog how to play. Dogs don't know what you're doing.
Yeah.
Dogs don't know what this bounce means. And a lot of people are like, come on, buddy. And they keep saying, come on, come on. And then dog's like, I have no idea what you're saying. Right. But once that dog figures out how to play, this dog will do anything. Anything. It's the craziest thing in the world. And it's addicting. And once you figure it out, Dr. Menon, you're gonna have amazing times.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun, great.
I'm gonna show you a book that I have these books that I refer back to. You might like them.
Does your dog go to the office or is it just at home?
Mine
does both,
No.
but I don't like it's depends on the day, it's not a testing day for sure.
Yes. Yeah, we're virtual only, so Murphy's not a happy camper because he loved being a therapy dog, but we'll probably do some volunteer work or something.
So if you like to read, I don't know if my thing's mirrored. Is it mirrored? Yeah, it's mirrored. Anyway, it's called Applied Dog Behavior and Training, and there's 3 volumes. And I mean, they're actual scholarly books, but it talks about just like how you were talking about, where you guys have everything written down from this age to this age, you're supposed to do this. From this age to this age, you're supposed to do this. The same thing with dogs, right? So from 0 to 8, 9 weeks, it's very important for that dog to stay with the mother. And it's not just for a nutritional aspect. It's for socialization. It's for the comfort. There's so much stuff packed up into that. And then it talks about the developmental period from like 9 to 13 weeks and 13 weeks to 21 weeks and so on and so forth. But the difference in that compared to us is whenever it's that dog's developmental period, that's stuff that you got to interact and engage that dog too, because that's whenever they're going to learn that. And that's when it's very important for them to have exposure to that. Because if you have a situation to where a dog's not socialized until 2 years old, it's huge. And you have to do some crazy rehabilitation in order to socialize that dog just because you missed that time frame from, 13 weeks all the way to 21 weeks. If you would have done it just in that aspect, you would have a dog that's social with everything and everyone. So it talks about and it breaks down those weekly brain development or cognition areas that you really have to emphasize on during that developmental period to avoid any sort of behavior or aggression or anything like that. So it's very interesting. If you like to read, you'd like that.
Very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, I guess it's time to wrap up. I guess no comments or anything, but Vanita, do you want to say the name of your practice and how people can get in touch with you if they're wondering about, ADHD testing, autism testing, learning differences testing? How can they contact you?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I think it's been a great discussion today. And when I'm not hanging out here, I'm at Thrive Collective based out of Ottawa, Illinois. And we have Facebook, Instagram, website, but you can send consultation requests through the website, and be happy to reach out. I'm an awesome practice manager now who helps everyone get connected, and off they go. No more glitches. So.
And I highly recommend Vanita for up-to-date testing information. She stays current. Like I said, so many unfortunately, people who are doing the testing are going off of outdated information, especially when testing adults. Sometimes they use inappropriate measures that are really normed for kids. for ADHD and autism, and to go see her and get, you can be very confident that you're going to get a good evaluation from her.
Thank you very much. And it's been a great conversation today. Fun to geek out together.
Yay,
Yeah.
thank you.
And again, with Dr. Vanita, she's available in 30 states. So for anybody listening on
Like
the
32,
podcast,
I think. I think it's
Oh, yeah. 30
I
plus,
think it's 32 now. I don't know. It keeps adding.
right?
good. And anybody listening on the podcast, how to spell her name? First name is Vanita, Vinita. Last name is Menon, Menon. And again, Dr. Menon, thank you so much for joining us. We had an absolute blast, and I really appreciate your time. This was very fun.
Thank you so much. The hour just flew by. So thanks for the
It
fun.
did. Thank you.
Well, all right, y'all. Well, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, guys.